Hello, how are you? How is your week going? Yes, it was crazy day today, yeah? Okay. What is the weather in your place? Very hot weather. Same. Last time you asked me in the comment to read English version of Harry Potter. So today me and Prahlamystic will do this for you. We will read Harry Potter tonight. So just lay down, close your eyes, and be ready to sleep. And I'll read for you. Okay? Will you sleep? I promise. Okay. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that were they perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was a director of a firm called Grananins, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice as usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent too much of her time scanning over gardens, fences, spying of the neighbors. Like Prahlamystic, spying neighbors. The Dursley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finest boy anywhere. The Dursley had anything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody wouldn't discover it. They didn't think they could bear on it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mr. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleys as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think that the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived on the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, but they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up in the town, Great Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious thing would soon be happen all over the country. Mr. Dursley, who made as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley, who sipped away happily as she wrestles a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tiny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mr. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was not having a damn trap and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little Duke chortled Mr. Dursley as she left the house. He got into his car and backed out of Numbers 4 Drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize that he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a thick of light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in the mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No, looking at sign, cats couldn't read map or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the angle of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these waiters strangling quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was engaged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that he was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting of something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the grinning parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mrs. Dursley was always sat with his back to the window in his office on the men's floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swoop ink past in broad daylights, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had ever seen an owl ever at mid-time, at 9 time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. There yelled a drive different people. He made several important telephone calls and shooted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he stretched his legs and walked across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collection tin. It was on this way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, and he caught a few words of what they were saying. "The Potters, that's right, that's what I hear, yes, their son, Harry." Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if they wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number. Then he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were a lot of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't ever sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never ever seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point to worry Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still no worries that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a quaky voice that made Passerby stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir. No, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who was done at last. Ever muggles like yourself should be celebrated this happy happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. The Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he was being called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking around its eyes. "Shoo," said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his life. Mr. Dursley had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mr. Next Door problems with her daughter, and now Dursley had learned a new word, want. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. Then Dudley had been put to bed. He went into the living room at time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watched everywhere were reported that the nation owl have been behaving very unusually today. Although all normally hunt at night and were hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of this bird flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin, most mysterious, and now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. "Going to be any more shower of owl tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owl that have been acting oddly today. Views as far apart of Kent, Yorkshire and Daddy have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they have had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating something early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise I wet nothing tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Brighton, owls flying by daylights, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. "Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. "No," she said. sharply. "Why? Funny stuff of the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "All shooting stars, and there are a lot of funny-looked people in town today." "So?" snapped Mrs. Dursley. "Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, you know." Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her had the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "Their son had be about Dudley age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley. What is his name again?" "Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty. Common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley. His heart thickened horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." This is small part of first chapter of Harry Potter. If you want me to keep going, to read English book with my Russian accent, you know which fingers you need to push, or just write me on the comment, and me and Prahlamystik will read more English books for you. Also, you can write me which books you want me to read, and I'll do. I think you will have a good day and a good night. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe my channel.